consecrate his labors to truth and to light. Then he appears and gives the key to the mystery and then vanishes again and is seen no more. This represents, Mrs. Atwood's thinking, what we would almost term today the archetypal psychological teacher, locked within our own consciousness and locked also within the consciousness of universals. In the root of every integration or organization that exists in nature is the mysterious fact of the immutable mathematical formula upon which that organization is based. Everything in the root of itself is instinctively a work of light. Everything has within its own nature the strange seal of its own identity. Elias the artist is perhaps partly tradition, partly the great story that has come down to us. Partly it is also the subconscious teacher in ourselves, the old one, the folk consciousness that we have. Perhaps it is descended to us in our blood, in our heredity. Perhaps it is the symbol of the infinite sequence of previous embodiments by which we have come to our present state. But it is the old one and the true one locked in us, locked in our conscious experience, and available only to us when we have ourselves performed the works of light. So the struggle or the labor always concerns with this. And now Mrs. Atwood goes into considerable detail in relation to Neoplatonism, quoting from Plotinus, Proclus, and many of the other mystics of North Africa and Athens, relating to the works of light in terms of the motion of consciousness itself from ignorance to illumination. Illumination being, of course, the final absorption into light. And man's growth as an hermetic experience deals with the 7 steps of the ladder of alchemy. And this ladder, the Escalade de la Sage, is in actuality the same as the 7 steps of Bacon's mysterious ladder of the arts, or ladder of wisdom. In this, consciousness ascends through 7 steps, represented by the orbits of the planets, which are in turn the alchemical symbols of the elements. Therefore, as the metals and the elements are arranged upon a ladder, or to form the links of the golden chain of Homer, which bound earth to the pinnacle of Olympus, so this ladder of the wise represents the 7 ascending levels of human consciousness, by means of which man rises from ignorance to universal insight. All this, of course, is theoretically quite understandable, but the question always remains, how is it done? How is it physically, psychologically, or spiritually possible to perform this work? This becomes, of course, the difference between theoretical alchemy and practical alchemy. And it is the method of how this can be done, and not the fact that it can be done, which constitutes the esoteric doctrine in the Hermetic sciences. Mrs. Atwood senses this and realizes it, and tries, in the light of the study of many of these deep works, to put together a formula, a pattern, not now to be used chemically, although she believes, and most alchemists have taught, that the formula for the regeneration of man will also regenerate the metals. But to discover this mystical insight by means of which the human being can achieve the transmutation of his own consciousness from darkness into light, or to free the souls of the metals from their bodies, in order that they may unite to form the universal medicine. Now, all the alchemists have agreed upon one thing, namely that you cannot combine the souls of metals while these metals are in various conditions of their own development. You cannot take the outward bodies of elements and force these bodies together. You cannot take common lead and mingle it with iron and produce anything more than a kind of alloy of lead and iron. These two will not accept each other. They will not become actual souls united. They will only be bodies united and souls in stress. Alchemy creates another symbol, the hermetic mercury, the mysterious symbol of the universal solvent. Mercury is said to be the one element that will accept other elements into its own soul. Therefore, mercury becomes, in a mysterious way, in the alchemical tradition, the symbol of Christ, because also it is the child of the sun and moon, or the offspring of heaven and earth. But even in the case of these elements, the alchemists tell us definitely that crude iron and crude silver cannot be united to produce the mystery. That before these elements can be combined, they must die. For unless the seed dies, says St. Paul, it shall not live again. Therefore, the mystery, like the mystery of the early Christian convert, is the mystery of the firstborn of them that sleep in death. The whole story has to be a story of resurrection. It has to be a story of the rolling away of the stone and of the empty sepulchre. It is the story of that which has risen from its own mortality to become the eternal proof and hope of immortality for all creatures. For in the resurrection of Christ, said the old apostles, is the proof of the resurrection of all that lives. This in turn, relating to the metals in the alchemical mystery, is that the metals must die. They must be crucified. They must descend into darkness. They must pass into limbo, which is the retort, or the alchemical vessel. And here they must be caused to suffer, as in a purgatorial, which is a purging or cleansing. And here, in the due course of time, they will ultimately be forgiven or restored by the descent of Christ into limbo for the salvation of souls. So now our alchemists tell us that these elements must die. And the question is, what are meant by these elements? I think that the Buddhist would answer that very simply, that these elements are the sensory perceptions and the mental focus. They are the elements that form the mysterious six-pointed star with the sun or self or sattva in the center, the mysterious shield of David of the Jewish Kabbalah. These representing then the psychic integration centers of man, representing the powers of the sensory perceptions. These must die in order that their own secret energy may be released again. So that only by man's victory over the senses is the message or the power or the true reality that is locked in these senses, as in the basic matter of experience. Only in this way can it be released. So we come to meditation, to Zen, to practically any of the disciplines of Neoplatonism or the ancient Greeks. For the death of the sensory perceptions is simply quietude, meditation, the absolute relief of man from the pressure of the objective functions of his own composite nature. The man becoming still causes confusion to die in him. And it is the death of confusion that results in the rise of value. For when the confusion of the testimony of the senses has been stilled, then the wisdom that is locked in these senses becomes compatible and can mingle. Thus, when the senses and their functions are suspended, the principle of consciousness upon which they all depend, is realized in its unity. In other words, the elements, the principles, the energies of the senses' perceptions can be alchemically united as long as the senses themselves do not function. So by a complete suspension of the personal, the universal elements within us can come together. But while we continually disturb these elements by our own objective awareness, they cannot come together. Mrs. Atwood feels that this is the burden of part of the Eleusinian mystery ritual, and certainly of Neoplatonism, which is based thereon, and the Orphic Rhapsodies. That these tell the story of a mystical suspension of error and illusion, by means of which reality can reaffirm itself, by which the individual will find in principles these things which he cannot discover while he is addicted to the shadows or appearances of things. Let us take a simple example of the point involved, namely take religion. We will imagine that an individual is torn between religion and science. While religion is in its crystallized integration within himself, while religion in him is a series of specific beliefs, while religion has to do with the consubstantiation of the host, while religion has to do with the assumption of the Virgin, while religion has to do with the co-eternity of the three persons of the Trinity. While these factors are in consciousness, religion is working in its own way, but it is not assimilable with anything else. We go then over to science, and we say that while this man is dedicated to biology, so that his universe moves around the central axis of biological situation, or he is a physicist, or he is an astronomer, or he is dedicated to any of the works of the light of science, he is then not only involved, but by his own limitations imposed upon his own areas, he cannot even circumscribe the whole boundary of science. He is only working with a little area. A scientist thus engaged and preoccupied, and a religionist thus engaged and preoccupied, cannot meet. They can have certain superficial, friendly relationships, perhaps, but they have no identity, no conscious realization of each other. Yet if either of these was able to completely disassociate his consciousness from any aspect of his labor or reactive work, and go to the substance of it. If the religionist could separate religion from theology, if the scientist could separate science from the sciences, in other words, perform this alchemical reduction to source, then science would realize that the substance upon which it is built is inevitable, immutable, universal law. And the religionist would discover that the substance upon which faith is built is inevitable and immutable, universal law. In their principles, therefore, these two can unite. But once they have become structures, they cannot unite. This is why alchemy says that you have to destroy the outward forms of things. You have to calcinate them. You have to burn them or corrupt them or destroy them until nothing of the body remains but ashes. Then the living spirit within these things can unite. For in all life there is an identity of truth light. And this identity of truth light is the secret of compatibility. And compatibility, or the union or mingling and identification of these elements, finally represents the amalgam from which the great stone of the wise is projected by alchemy. So first, by the reduction of all things to their essences, they become susceptible of union. And out of the union of these divided elements comes the sudden re-experience of the unity of the archetype of life from which they descended. The continual discovery of increasing unities. The ascent from particulars to generals. The gradual disintegration of the external natures of things and the re-establishment of their internals. In this way, the great alchemical transmutation takes place. This can be put in terms of chemistry and will probably operate chemically. It can be put in terms of religion and will operate religiously, or in terms of philosophy. But in man, the peculiar term of it is in the term of yogic consciousness searching. For the whole redemption of man lies in the reduction of the confusion or complexity of man to the absolute stillness, which is the death of the divided parts. And then from the death of these divided parts, a spirit rises. The spirit released from confusion, released from difference, from discord, and from the various vibratory patterns of elements, suddenly is restored to its own right nature. So in the alchemical tradition, again, the purpose is forever to reduce the bodily interference of things with the unfoldment of the life within body. The grand experiment is therefore to be attained in universal conscious re-identification with the infinite. This means the final elimination of the dross in all things, the transmutation of every base metal into principle, the final falling away of all bodies, illusions, beliefs, creeds, sects, divisions, which exist primarily in the mental nature of man. When these fall away, when these are overcome, when these are relaxed and released so that they no longer interfere, then man gradually brings together the essences of all things. And in the reunion of essences within the living alchemical retort of his own soul, man achieves the great transmutation. He becomes the adept, he becomes the yoga, he attains the samadhi, he becomes the embodiment of the entire discipline of antiquity, which had for its essential purpose the production of the man of light, the production of the luminous androgyne, the great complete composite being, which is hidden from us by the confusion and complexity of our own mortal existence. So alchemy approached in this way is the burden of Mrs. Atwood's study. And I think as we proceed with it, we realize, and we will realize more if we read her work, the tremendous amount of thought and the tremendous amount of insight that went into it. We wonder at the strange story of how it was done. We know the universe works mysteriously. Perhaps in her we had some strange alchemical transmutation by which, in the early years of the 19th century, she was able to produce this work. In any event, it is a dignified and important volume, and certainly one of the worthiest to appear in the interpretation of the Hermetic arts. Well, I think we'd better let you get your bus and go home now.